Blog Talk Radio.
Outside of the government need to take a step back. They need to calm the situation and avoid further loss of life. We also strongly oppose a return to a state of emergency law, and we call on the government to respect basic human rights, including freedom of peaceful assembly and due process under the law. And we believe that the state of emergency should end as soon as possible. Violence is simply not a solution in Egypt or anywhere else.
All right, Patty Culhane joins us live from Washington. Patty, there, perhaps stronger words than used than in the past, some criticism from John Kerry, but to what extent are we seeing a real change of U.S. policy towards the administration and authorities in Egypt?
Sammy, from my position, it doesn't seem as the U.S. position has changed at all. Let's remember, it was Secretary of State John Kerry who came out on camera and made that condemnation, the strong condemnation. President Barack Obama, as far as we can tell, hasn't picked up the phone at all since President Mohamed Morsi was deposed. White House officials, though, won't even confirm that on the record. One of the things that Kerry said, and this is probably the closest they've come yet to pointing blame, he said that the military and the interim government holds the preponderance of power in this situation and has the unique responsibility. So that's not coming right out and saying what the military did was wrong. He talks about the acts being deplorable without attributing them to either side. And again, the Secretary Kerry, which he always does, talks about they called for the protests to remain peaceful, implying that the protests weren't peaceful, trying to spread the blame. It's clear from their public statements they are trying to keep an open door to the Egyptian military.
You know what I'm going to ask you next, Patty? What about the U.S. aid? Any signals there that there might be even perhaps some review of how much, how soon is given to the military-backed administration as well as the military?
The White House officials say they're reviewing it, but I have to tell you, Sammy, they always say they're reviewing it. They've been saying that since the day that President Morsi was deposed. They say clearly, and they still say, that they don't believe it's in U.S. national interest to cut off aid. There isn't a lot of appetite in Congress to do that. There's reports that the very powerful pro-Israeli government lobby, AIPAC, has been urging Congress not to force the president's hand. And what this comes down to, basically, if the president doesn't choose to follow what many see as the law of the land, which says that a coup means the aid has to be cut off, the only people who can really force his hands are members of Congress, and there have been only a handful of those who've spoken out, called for the president to do that. So far, they haven't gained the traction that would be needed or the political will that would be needed to force the president to do anything.
What do we know at this point in terms of what sort of conversations are being had then perhaps behind the scenes with the authorities in Egypt, and what sort of message may be going on?
Well, we do know that Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, Secretary of State John Kerry, and also some of the leaders of the U.S. military have been on the phone with their counterparts almost daily. And what they say publicly they've been urging is restraint. And you heard Secretary Kerry mention that. There's also been on-the-ground diplomacy. A very high-ranking member of the State Department went there, stayed in Cairo, extended his stay. Two senators, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, very influential, went there. They said that they hoped to broker some sort of negotiation. Those negotiations fell apart, and the three came back to the United States. Still, the U.S. maintains that it believes it has some sort of leverage in Egypt, although right now it doesn't appear that at least what their public calls have been listened to.
From BR on the World, this is the News in 10. Bostonred here. We are basically live here. We are pre-recording this, but events are moving very fast in the Egyptian state. Over 1,000 people have been killed, and another 1,000, as high as 3,000, have been wounded in a massive attack by the military services under the command of General El-Sisi, the commander of the Egyptian military. And as we go out here, you'll hear from the Al Jazeera, and the reason we're using that is their combined services. They covered the morning violence, and it's in the night. It's about 7 o'clock, their last report, that's dark in Egypt. It is actually past that now. You have to look to see exactly what time it is, but it is nighttime in Egypt. More Morsi supporters are coming out. Also, supporters of various people are burning Coptic churches, and the problem there is the head of the Coptic church had endorsed the military under this coup d'etat against Mohamed Morsi. So there is much trouble within Egypt. Evidently there has been a conscious effort made by the quote-unquote West to continue this. There are reports from Patty Calhoun, you heard as we come in here, that the Zionist lobby within the U.S. has asked people in the Congress not to force the president's hand. Under American law, when there is a coup d'etat, all foreign aid should be, and military aid must be cut off to the Egyptian government. They have not went that far. There has been virtually no word from the White House, the Obama government, with the exception of John Kerry. But the situation there is, as Calhoun pointed out, they basically tried to blame both sides, and it is not both sides. The armored car, the attack helicopters are under the administration of Egyptian military forces, period. And that is where the blame lies for the thousands wounded, and over 1,000 people have died. The blood is in the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, Nasser City, and various other locations. Now, the response in the U.S. has been the same as from the EU. It's muted. There is no talk about fly zones. There's no talk about sending humanitarian aid into the Morsi supporters. There is no talk about, on the part of the so-called defense hawks like John Kerry and Senator Graham, that went there to visit General al-Sisi of any type of military aid or any type of no-fly zones or anything of that. There's no talk by the Emirates or anyone else around of giving money and arms to the forces in Egypt. The Justice and Freedom Party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. But the problem there is that this thing will not die. This is the makings of a civil war because of the aspirations of the people. Mohamed Abadi, the appointed vice president, resigned, and several others. So the secular people are out, the military is in, and this all has the makings of a pressure cooker. And this is the reason we feel that the army moved when it did, and with the obviously after consulting their masters in the West. But will this work? This is a throwback to the same policies that the U.S. has had in that area since Ronald Reagan and before. And there are negotiations going on between the Palestinians and Israeli state, a separate issue. But the issue of the Arabs in that area is a very volatile issue. You have in virtually every country, or you'll hear here from Bahrain, there are protesters there as part of the so-called Arab Spring. And the evolution there, they call it the Egyptian Revolution. It is actually an evolution. The General Mohammed Mubarak was deposed, and he's in jail now, a military hospital, I assume. He was in the cage. That's the way they do it there. But nonetheless, now a new cast of characters have, as they say, came in here, and increasingly various provinces, cities are placed under the command of former military leaders. So they are using the same cookie cutter. The only question here is in Tahrir Square and various other places, will the millions of people once again come out? They can kill several thousand people and wound tens of thousands of people, but if they're put in a position where they have to kill hundreds of thousands of people, then the Kerrys of the world, the Grahams, etc., the European Union there will be forced to act. It will be a worldwide catastrophe which will be called genocide. And people will not stand idly by and expect that. So basically what is happening right now is the blood is in the streets, and unfortunately more Egyptian blood in the thousands and hundreds of thousands will have to, as they flow in the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and various other cities, before the world will act. Now, via social media, it is seen, and you will start to see protests in the Western nations. Nothing happening in the U.S. yet. That will come later. People haven't quite figured it out. One of the problems there is that people saw the so-called Arab Spring as a move forward, but it was really not a move forward. It was a move from one dictatorship to the next dictatorship. And under President Morsi, there was no change in the policy. What they're scared of is if groups that, not necessarily Mohammed Morsi, but other groups that come to power will have totally a different agenda. One is more closely, as one would say, in sync with the feelings of the majority of Egyptian people. Now, this is what the West is afraid of here, and how it turns out, we don't know. But one thing we do know is the the Egyptian army is not capable of maintaining itself without funding and equipment from the West. If that ceased, they could not get spare parts, or they get money to pay the soldiers. Chaos would be there. So this is where we are on the 14th day. It's a special report from us of August 2013. We'll see you tomorrow at our usual time. Is around 6 Eastern time from New York. This is Bostonred. Good day.
The shooting started at 7 a.m. The snipers fired from surrounding apartments. The panic started.
Problem. Yeah, big problem. Yes, yes. Look.
For 30 minutes, all were pinned down as the assault grew closer. Shots coming in and going out. In Rabbah Mosque, what was a refuge for women and children, became a place filled with fear.
Inside the Rabbah Mosque, which until a few hours ago was a shelter for women and children, has now become a makeshift hospital. And while we've been here, we have seen dozens of injured and several dead people being brought in, many the victim of gunshots.
With the first lull in fighting, the wounded began to arrive, and then the dead. There are also lots of birdshot injuries, walking wounded filled with anger.
You must kill all the warlocks. What we have suffered from. We have suffered from killers, just the killers.
Soon enough, the number of casualties was so overwhelming, people were treated where they lay. The media centre became a makeshift hospital for the seriously injured, dozens of wounded, all gunshot victims, a triage of sorts with precious little to treat them. Our camera, a focus for these people's fury with the military and their message for the outside world.
That our president is Morsi, that we are calling for legitimacy. This is our point of view. That's why they are killing us. This is not legal. They are in a war.
It was expected, but few were prepared for it. Simon McGregor Wood, Al Jazeera, in Rabbah Mosque, Nasser City.
7 p.m. And at 7 p.m. we went to Masjid Iman, where all the people from Rabbah, after the crackdown finished, went.
Right, before we talk about what was happening at Masjid al-Iman, Iman Mosque at 7 o'clock at night, tell me what you saw as you tried to head back into Rabbah al-Adawiyah Square this morning when the crackdown was going on.
We were trying to organize ourselves into groups to make a siege on the troops, because you had police troops and you had military troops and then you had police troops. Were the three different barricades that were on Tehran Street, which is the street which leads from Nasr City to Rabbah. We were trying to get through them or through any streets inside to get in. There were snipers, and the snipers were shooting at that time rubber bullets, and the aircraft helicopters were shooting gas. Now that gas, it just burns. I've never experienced it like that, and it just burns you and makes you choke and you can't move. So what we were thinking is that try to make them throw the gas at us so we'll lighten the stress and lighten it on the people at Rabaa. So some people tried to get in, and they could through the inner streets. They could get in, and other people were waiting out on the Tehran street to make them not go in.
All right, now the Minister of Interior says only gas was used, nothing else, and certainly not live shots.
Because a lot of us got the rubber. I didn't get it, but everybody around me got it, and they've got it in their pockets. If anybody wants to go and see those people at the Iman Mosque now, they all have it in their pockets. The rubber bullets were used, and they are in the bodies of most of the people.
And now, did you see any evidence of live fire being used?
Now, there was one instance where that was used, was when a group of army vehicles were coming in, about 20. Each one had about 11 soldiers in them, and they were heading from the street parallel to Tehran Street, and they wanted to get into Tehran Street and go down to Rabaa. The youth ran to them, and they slept. They just sat and squatted in front of them and slept in front of them, and told them, no, you're not going to get through, you're not going to get into Rabaa. I started walking and talking to every one of those armed because I told them that think about your mothers will curse you. Don't just tell them we couldn't, turn back, or your mothers will curse you. And they were turning back and going back. Then about 50 police special forces in black with live bullets came and started firing while the youth were sleeping. The youth all dispersed and scattered and went down the opposite way. And
are you saying that? How do you know it was live fire? Are you saying that they were shooting bullets?
From the sound, because we're very familiar with the sound of smoke bomb, rubber, live bullet. We know the difference now. We've been there for 7 days, and we've been in rallies every morning, every night. And there are, if you go to the streets over there, you will find the shots on the ground. Now,
some might ask, what prompted you to try and go back into Rabaa Square when it was clear there was a crackdown going on there? Wouldn't it have been safer to leave the area?
Everybody was going back, because all the rallies, we had a very big rally from Masjid Salem, which is from higher Nasr City going down. We had another one coming from Heliopolis. We had one coming from Ramses. Everyone was making rallies and getting back into Rabaa. The idea is, I've been there for the 47 days. I've tried to sleep there or go in the morning. Most of the time I've tried to be there when I'm not working, or I have time and leave my mom. But the idea of being there is that our just cause. We are for the democracy of Egypt. We're saving it from being sold to the Jews and to the Americans. And
all right,
because we had a democratic Islamic state.
Thank you so much, Wafat Hafni. Well, the Egyptian Interior Minister also spoke in the past few hours. This is his account of what happened during the breakup of the camps.
Once personnel were deployed to sites, we were surprised by large numbers of protesters setting up barracks on the curbs and taking certain positions. They started to fire live ammunition and cartridges heavily and intensely in the direction of security forces, who continued to show self-restraint. The personnel deployed succeeded in dealing and addressing the situation with the highest degree of professionalism to end the sit-in without losses.
A short while ago, Mohammed Sudan of the Freedom and Justice Party reacted to the Interior Minister's speech.
Just to kill at least 2,600 people in a few hours, that was never happened before, even in the war of 1973 against the Israeli troops. that never been killed such these numbers. And then when they're doing this just in one day, and the end of the day they raid the field hospitals and they burn all the corpse in the front of the people. I think this is a kind of war.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the interim Vice President, Mohammed al-Baradei, has quit in protest against the violence used by security forces against protesters. In a resignation letter to the President, al-Baradei said there were peaceful options for ending the political crisis. The beneficiaries of what happened today are those who call for violence, terrorism and the most extreme groups. Shireen Tandros is live for us in our Cairo bureau. First of all, Shireen, I've been speaking to people who have been talking about other protest sites popping up, people gathering around a mosque, another mosque called Al Iman Mosque in Nasser City. Tell us, what is the situation on the ground? Has it gone quiet?
Yeah, it's eerily quiet here, Sami, and we're of course based in downtown Cairo, and on any other night you'd expect the October Bridge behind me and the surrounding streets to be bustling with people, and hardly anyone on the streets right now. But we have heard that there are protests taking place in other cities across Egypt, and as you were just mentioning there, at the Iman Mosque, which is the mosque that Wafat was just speaking about, your guest, earlier on in the show. At that mosque, which is near Rabaa Adawiya, there are a group of people who are essentially trying to wait for some sort of permission to go over to Rabaa, the sit-in that was dispersed this morning, and try and find the bodies of their loved ones and their friends. And that essentially is a situation, as we understand it, that coming to us from sources, security sources, as well as sources within the Muslim Brotherhood. So we'll have to watch and see what happens there.
An interesting development, to say the least, the resignation of the Vice President. What does that tell us about what's going on and sort of how unified the political ranks are around the army, and what's, sort of been going on behind the scenes over the last few days, and what might continue to go on?
Right, well, I think that the fractures within this very fragile political process and the interim cabinet started to show before today, in the run-up to the dispersal, as reports started to surface on exactly how the Interior Ministry was planning to deal with these sit-ins. Various members of this interim cabinet had come out saying they know that they're the minority voices within the cabinet, but they are trying to urge the military to restrain themselves, not to go in and forcibly disperse these protests. They were trying to essentially buy for time to try and find a political solution out of this. Now it seems that minority group, which included of course the Vice President Mohammed al-Baradei, lost their battle, and the military has sidelined those kind of voices. We've heard reports throughout the day that Mohammed al-Baradei is not the only minister to resign, but those so far have been unconfirmed by the presidency, so we just have to wait and see. But clearly there is a fracture here within the cabinet, and how that will play out in the coming days in terms of the political process, I think will be very interesting.
Another interesting point. Earlier today we had a line coming out about one of the groups, Jamaat Islamiyah, telling people not to attack churches, and that's exactly what seems to be happening across Egypt. Tell us about the ability of some of these groups to keep a lid on the violence and keep a control on their protesters and supporters.
Well, clearly it is very difficult, because over the course of the day we've heard various reports coming from sources, especially in Upper Egypt, which, remember, has a large community of Coptic Christians, of attacks not just on churches but on coffee shops, on shops and businesses that belong to Coptic Christians in that area. Now, the source in the Coptic Church has confirmed to Al Jazeera that at least 17 churches were attacked, some of those churches torched throughout the course of the day. A lot of that happened just in the few hours after the dispersal of the sit-in, and they're calling this, of course, reprisal attacks, because the Christian community has been seen here as siding with the military ever since the coup, and certainly the Pope, the Coptic Pope, has also certainly been on the side, if you like, of the interim leadership here throughout the last few weeks. So it is a worrying development, and one that you have to watch very carefully here, because sectarian attacks like this could escalate, and the fact is that it doesn't take very much to spark the sort of sectarian violence that we've been seeing throughout the course of the day.
All right, thanks so much, Shireen. Lots more still to talk about. Well, we'll come back and pick this up with you later, no doubt. Thanks so much. Shireen Tadros there. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has weighed in on the situation in Egypt. He's calling Wednesday's violence deplorable. We'll have more on that in a moment. But first, a little reaction now from Europe and the European Union as it urged the interim government to end the state of emergency as soon as possible. Bernardino Leon is the EU Special Representative for the Southern Mediterranean. He joins us live from the Spanish city of Malaga. Good to have you with us. First of all, the Egyptian administration is congratulating the security service on what they call showing restraint. Your assessment of how the authorities handled the process today, would you describe it as restraint?
No, I would not, and I think that the fact that there were clearly other alternatives to solve this problem, and they have not been exhausted, they have not been explored, shows that there was no restraint. Restraint would have been going in the direction of political dialogue.
Now, what will the EU's next step be? I know there have been calls in the last few weeks. You've called on the administration and the authorities to respect the right to demonstrate, to respect the protest, the sit-ins. That hasn't happened. Is it time for the EU to think of something else other than simply calls?
Well, I think the strategy will be to keep working for democracy and for inclusion. I think that the 2011 revolution was clearly a revolution for dignity, meaning a different political situation and a different economic situation. What we have seen today is unfortunately not going in that direction. We will keep working in the coming days and weeks and months for this to happen. And the tools, the instruments we will use is something we have to discuss. I think member states have been very active today, and EU institutions, Cathy Ashton has been very actively involved in the last weeks and days and hours, of course. And we will see what are the means that the international community can use together with all Egyptians to go back to a credible transition.
Let me put a question to you that I'm hearing from people on the streets there. They ask, what more will it take for the EU to perhaps to know at this point what instruments and tools it needs to use? We've seen in other situations European countries cutting relations, withdrawing their ambassadors, posting forms of diplomatic protest. Now we have protesters dying on the streets of Egypt, and the EU seems to be in a position where it still needs to review and reflect and discuss what its next instrument might be.
Well, there are many possible instruments. As I said very clearly, today's situation, not only storming the square, which is probably the worst one, but also the state of emergency, also widespread violence in all the cities. This will require a very strong answer from, and is already gathering a strong answer from the international community. It's not that I don't want to define the different tools and instruments we can use. It's just that we have to decide which ones we will use. But I'm sure if you analyze the statement that Lady Ashton made today, you will see that the response has been quite strong from the European Union and from many other international actors.
All right, thanks so much for your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring you the latest pictures that have come in from the Egyptian capital. Let's see if we can pop them up for you there. These pictures are coming in from state television. As you can see there, there's quite a messy aftermath left in parts of the Egyptian capital. It does appear to be, well, certainly there's a lot of smoke, and looks like perhaps also fires burning in the streets there. So clearly a very fluid and messy situation left over there after hundreds of people have been killed and wounded in the crackdown on pro-Morsi protesters. Incredible pictures there, looks like a bus on fire. Let's get the rest of the news from around the world now. Let's head over to Julie MacDonald in London. Julie.
Sammy, thank you. Indian Navy divers say they've been unable to detect any signs of life on a submarine that was crippled by 2 explosions. 18 sailors were on board the vessel in Mumbai at the time. The cause of those blasts is not yet known. Here's Charlie Angela.
This is the moment a large explosion ripped through the INS Sindhurakshak. Filmed on a mobile phone, the blast was heard for miles. It's understood the Russian-made submarine was one of 3 moored along the quayside when the incident happened.
After an explosion, the line gate was closed. I called up my driver. He said a submarine had caught fire due to a cylinder blast. We moved to a side. We heard 4 explosions. Then there was a stampede.
It took firefighters more than 3 hours to control the blaze. In a statement, the Indian Navy said, due to as yet unknown damage suffered as a result of the explosion, the submarine has submerged at her berth with only a portion visible above the surface. About 18 persons were on board the submarine at the time of the accident. Navy divers have entered the vessel but found no signs of life.
Lost to all of us. It was tragedy in the recent time. I feel sad about that. I feel sad about also those Navy personnel who lost their lives in the service of the country.
This is not the first time that Sindhurakshak has suffered an onboard fire. 3 years ago, 1 sailor died and 2 others were injured when a battery fire broke out while it was in port. After that incident, it was sent to Russia for a major refit. Much of India's military hardware is supplied by Moscow, from jet fighters to submarines. But historically, Russian submarine technology has suffered problems themselves, illustrated by the sinking of the Kursk in August 2000. The Indian Navy has been trying to develop its own major vessels. This was its newest asset, the aircraft carrier Vikrant, being launched just on Tuesday. But for the moment, attention is fixed on the incident in Mumbai. Charlie Angela, Al Jazeera.
Médecins Sans Frontières has announced the closure of all of its programs in Somalia. The aid organization says it's because of extreme attacks on its staff. 16 MSF workers have been killed in Somalia since 1991, and the charity had taken to employing armed guards. In a statement, MSF said ultimately civilians in Somalia will pay the highest cost. Bahraini police have reportedly fired tear gas at pro-democracy demonstrators. The crackdown came as activists blocked the inner streets of the Shakura village west of the capital, Manama. Now, security was tightened across the country as opposition groups turned to social media to organize mass rallies. Palestinians and Israelis have begun US-led peace talks in Jerusalem. It's the first formal negotiations in the region in nearly 5 years. The talks began just after Israel released 26 Palestinian prisoners as part of that peace deal. Many of the inmates had been behind bars for more than 20 years. Both sides are aiming to reach a deal within 9 months. 2 former employees of a major US bank have been charged in relation to the so-called London whale trading scandal. The men worked in JP Morgan Chase's chief investment office and are accused of falsifying records to cover up over $600 million in losses. Kristen Salumi has the very latest from New York.
Once a darling of Wall Street, these days JP Morgan Chase's reputation is tarnished. The latest in a series of scandals. 2 former employees are accused of trying to cover up last year's $6.2 billion derivatives trading loss. Javier Martin Artajo and Julian Grout have been charged in both criminal and civil court with falsifying documents and wire fraud. Bruno Ixel, the trader known as the London Whale who actually ran up the losses, is not being charged in exchange for his testimony in the case.
The defendants deliberately and repeatedly lied about the fair value of billions of dollars in assets on JP Morgan's books in order to cover up massive losses that mounted month after month at the beginning of 2012.
The full knowledge of the losses came to light in April of 2012, highlighting the bank's risk-taking with its own and customers' money. Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan Chase's CEO, famously dug himself into a hole by calling reports of the giant loss a tempest in a teapot. He was given a rough ride by a Senate committee that concluded J.P. Morgan Chase hid massive losses, disregarded risk, and tried to downplay its own failure after the scandal first became public. An activity critics say that should never have been allowed to happen while the firm was engaged in commercial banking.
What we see from the United States, not just the regulators, but from the Senate as well, and now from the FBI and prosecutors, is a real willingness to go after what it sees as wrongdoing, which may create instability in the economy over the longer term.
The criminal case against these two traders is just one of a series of ongoing probes against J.P. Morgan by both federal and state authorities. Regulators with the Securities and Exchange Commission are also reportedly seeking a settlement with the firm over the London whale case that could involve an admission of guilt as well as huge fines. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
We'll have more news later. For the moment, though, let's go back to Sammy in Doha.
Thanks so much, Julie. Well, still to come here on the News Hour. Streets on fire in some parts of the